Good morning, and live from F1 Gen, it's your host, classmate number 7, presenting about human migration. It's out of this continent. Today we'll have a team of esteemed scientists, researchers, ethicists, debating about where did you come from, where did you go. The first scientist to join us to explain what is human migration is Dr. Beginnings.
Hello, classmate number 7. Thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, before we begin, let's address what is human migration. So human migration is the physical movement of people from one place to another. It may be over long distances, such as moving from country to another, and it can occur as individuals, families, or larger groups. But today we have a team of scientists with us, and specifically we're going to be discussing what genetics can tell us about the early human migration of humans. And with new sequencing technology, scientists can even trace the movements of our ancestors over time and across different regions of the world. Advancements in this DNA sequencing technology has even made it possible to analyze DNA from ancient human remains. And by comparing the DNA of ancient and modern populations, researchers can track the movements of people over time.
You can even say that Dr. Beginning is migrating out of the studio.
Thank you.
And now joining us is Dr. Consent. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So, I hear that humans aren't from Eastern Africa?
Yes, so most of the data suggests that, well, we know already that humans originated from Africa, but up until recently, many of us thought that we originated from the eastern part of Africa, when a 2019 study rather suggests that we came from a more southern part of Africa over near the Zambezi River in the wetlands. And we know this because the researchers, they sampled people's blood native from Namibia in South Africa, and they looked at their mitochondrial DNA as well as other publicly available mitochondrial genomes. And what they found is that the L0 variant, indicated by the orange circle up on the map, is the oldest known mitochondrial variant lineage. And they found that a lot of that DNA traced back to these wetlands in southern Africa. And what we think is that as the climate changed, it pushed people outwards from that region into farther into Africa, as depicted by the arrows on the screen.
And here to explain where we went is Dr. Andrew. What's up?
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, so where did we go, Dr. Andrew?
What a fantastic question. So, as you can see, there are several proposed routes that are supported by different bits of genetic evidence. So first, I'll talk about the southern route, wherever we cross Ethiopia into Yemen via modern-day Yemen, of course, via a watered route.
And that's Ethiopia, right?
This is Ethiopia right here. So what's the genetic evidence for this? Well, scientists have done mitochondrial DNA analysis and show that there's a dispersal of the haplogroup L3 along this route. And so a haplogroup, of course, is a collection of similar haplotypes. And so this analysis shows that there's important similarities between these haplogroups, those in Ethiopia and those in Yemen. Further, scientists have also examined simple sequence repeats in early Homo sapiens along a route that goes through Yemen all the way along the coast into India. So once again, these similarities provide evidence that we moved along beaches towards India, and this of course would have started by a route from Ethiopia into Yemen. Now, in a conflictory hypothesis, there's another notion of a northern route, where instead we move through Egypt into the Near East via a land route, right? And that's going to be supported by also genetic evidence. And so what's the genetic evidence for this route? Well, scientists compared Y chromosome haplogroups and compared them to genetic markers of remains in the Near East. And the Near East consists of modern day countries such as Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and along with others. And there are similarities in these haplogroups that match up with a land route into the Levant. And further, ancient Ethiopian and Egyptian genomes were sequenced and compared to modern day non-Africans. Now, these modern day non-African genomes are much more similar to Egyptian genomes than Ethiopian genomes, which tells us that maybe a land route through Egypt was more likely. But undoubtedly, we dispersed from Africa elsewhere into the Eurasian landmass.
Yeah, and now we're here in the basement of the F1 Gen studio. Thank you, Dr. Andrew.
Of course, thank you.
All right. And now joining us is Dr. Neck. Welcome, Dr. Neck. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. You want to talk about the mass extinction?
Yes, so we had a mass extinction, a massive bottleneck, actually more than once, around 50 to 60,000 years ago. Our population did survive, as we can tell, and we're very grateful that our past ancestors were able to get past this.
And how do we know that?
Well, I'm going to hop into the experiments here. So the first experiment I covered was by William Amos and Joe Hoffman in the Human Genome Diversity Project. They're from the University of Cambridge, and they used a program called Bottleneck. So what they did was they analyzed 763 microsatellite markers from 53 populations, and it's quite interesting. They found that there was an imbalance in rare alleles and heterogynity between two regions. So the first region, which is supposedly the first bottleneck that we had, was in the Middle East. So, and that spread over to Yakut near the Bering Strait.
And how long ago was this?
This happened around 50 to 60,000 years ago.
A pretty long time ago.
Oh yeah, a very long time ago.
What did they find with this?
Well, they found that the first one was the Middle East, and that's because Africa is the kind of the central place where all humans originated from. And as they migrated out, they migrated towards the Middle East, and then something along the way happened, and we're going to get into more research about what could have possibly happened then. And then they went from there, after a bottleneck, to Yakut near the Bering Strait, and then they had another bottleneck, something else happened, which had limited the population to a near extinction level.
And does that have anything to do with this ominous volcano?
Well, that volcano is actually another research studied by Stanley H. Ambrose from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois. And they had wrote the Journal of Human Evolution, which they predicted that there was a volcanic winter that actually caused the bottleneck. However, this was actually proven to be false in their paper because they had archaeological evidence that the hunter and gatherer civilizations from India weren't too much affected by this eruption. And obviously, the eruption would have covered that area, and because they weren't affected by it, that means that it really shouldn't have had an impact because they were hunter-gatherers. So if it did have that much of an impact, they should have been affected, but they were not.
So it wasn't a volcano.
It was not a volcano, but they brought the fact that it could have been a disease.
So what actually happened?
Well, we're not entirely sure, but it's possible that there was a disease outbreak that took out most of the people, the civilizations in the Middle East and Yakut. Or it could have been some natural disaster that we just haven't been able to lock down, or some travel dilemmas like crossing seas or glaciers or anything of that sort.
All right, any last words?
Go University of Bottle.
After learning that this was going to be our segment, I decided to do some research on my own. There is a common misconception that humans descended from chimpanzees, but that is fake news. In reality, we have a common ancestor about 5 to 7 million years ago, which allows us to have 96% similar DNA. But mutations arose that resulted in de novo genes, like these on the board, that gave humans bigger, fleshier, wrinklier, meatier brains. But what does it mean to be human? Here to debate these questions are our ethicists, Dr. Respect and Dr. Consent. We'll be back after the break.
Hello, Dr. Beginnings here. Do you want to know where you begin? With Arturo Ancestry and a saliva sample, you can. Get yours today.
And welcome back to the segment about the ethics of human migration. And joining us today are Dr. Consent and Dr. Respect. So, Dr. Consent, I've heard that humans have Neanderthal DNA.
Yes, so this happened when early Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa and they started interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovians once they breached out. And so it happens to be today, people specifically of European descent have 2%, less than 2% of their genome is actually consisted of Neanderthal DNA.
And what are some like misconceptions about what Neanderthal DNA is? What does it mean to be human?
Yes, so similar to your misconception about chimpanzees, humans coming from chimpanzees, it's understanding the timeline of human evolution. And so we know that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted and that they interbred, but we know that now, today, only Homo sapiens exist. And so a misconception could be that if you have Neanderthal DNA, you are less human. That is not true. Because in reality, even if you have Neanderthal DNA, it's less than 2%. We still have 98% human Homo sapien DNA that we just share with other people. So we need to understand that just because we have differences in our DNA between people, we are all human at the core, and you can't really define someone as human just based on their genetic makeup. Because, for example, our genetic makeup consists of lots of DNA from past viruses. Does that make us a virus? Of course not. So we just need to understand that in the end, we are all human, and that we shouldn't let the differences between us dictate how we feel about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Being human is not up to like a molecular level, it's up to like a person level,
Yes, of
like
course.
doctor consent here. How do we even know that we have Neanderthal DNA in us?
So obviously there's been a lot of testing done on humans that are not alive and human remains to sequence this DNA and know how much of our genome comes from Neanderthals or other organisms. So that's where the ethical issue of whether taking DNA from human remains should be allowed, and who should consent this, who has a stake in this, and what are some of the cultural issues that can arise from a problem such as this.
So why do we even need to take DNA from human remains?
So obviously we could take DNA from humans that are alive, but we have a different set of mutations that humans in the past compared to humans in the past. So to completely understand the origins of humans and how we've evolved and how several alleles and mutations in us evolved, we need to understand the genomic components of humans in the past as well.
Is there any way to do this ethically if we need to do it?
Yes, so that's where these 5 guidelines that I'm about to talk about come into play. So these guidelines were developed by 60 archaeologists, scientists, and people who have a lot of knowledge on cultures around the world came up with. And these guidelines allow us to utilize human remains for research while still being ethical and taking the consent of the people who have a stake in the issue. So the first one is that researchers must ensure that all regulations were followed in the places that they dig up these human remains. So regulations that were set by the government or scientists in the area, and in case these regulations are too lax, researchers need to take a step further and actually research and understand the cultural background of the area and of the origins of those human remains so they can address it ethically without raising any issues. The second is that researchers must prepare a detailed plan. So once they get a hold of the people that do have a stake in the human remains, they need to make sure that they're completely aware that the remains and the DNA that will be acquired from the remains is not utilized unethically. So creating a plan and telling them how much of the remains they'll use and what will happen to the body after the remains are used and how the remains will be used to begin with. That brings me to the third point, where it's important that the researchers minimize the damage done to the human remains. Our history cannot be brought back, and it's really important that we preserve it, not only for like science sake, but also the cultural group that has a stake in the issue. The fourth point is that researchers must ensure that the data is made available for re-examination so that the results that they acquire from the human remains are actually true, and the research that is getting published does not anger the groups and political leaders that are there in the area. The last guideline, which ensures that the fourth is followed, is that the stakeholders in the issue need to know what is happening with the remains from the beginning of the study. So with the plan, they will know that, but it's important to let them know if you make any changes to the plan and return the human remains to them or the appropriate location afterwards.
All right, Dr. Consent, Dr. Respect, thank you for your enlightening discussion today. From our basement to your screen, live from F1 Gen. Join us next time in our next broadcast.